I've had way too many kids hanging up on embargo budget briefings to try that again. I'm not doing it. So I was like, whatever.
Wait, kids hanging up?
Oh, yeah. Like, I remember one of the first times I'll be holding one of my kids I only had one at the time. And I didn't know he could touch a phone or knew what a phone was. He was like 11 months old. And I'm trying to ask a budget question. He goes on a conference call. He goes, boop, on my phone.
Because there's a bright button.
This is a bright red button. I didn't know at the time that kids that young would do that.
Also, his instincts are right.
Oh, yeah.
You know
That's exactly.
I'm going to press the red button right now and say, it's time for Sound Politics.
You're listening to Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone.
And I'm Libby Denkmann. And normally here, Scott, we have this long show intro, and our guests are waiting very patiently and quietly for their chance to be brought into the conversation.
Blah, blah, blah.
But I don't do
we
that.
Can't do that
Sorry,
we can't do that because Melissa Santos is here. We literally wrote this into the intro.
What?
We can't do that because Melissa Santos is here, and she always finds a way to break in, and then we have to throw out the intro. And anyway, it's better. It's better when the guests come in right away.
So much better.
To be clear, though, we weren't recording. I thought when I was talking earlier, I wasn't interrupting.
Amazing.
I didn't think.
But
weren't. I was, apparently.
Melissa Santos of Axios, welcome to Sound Politics.
Hello.
And Paul Queary of the Washington Observer. Paul, much more patient, but I mean, neither one of our guests can be contained today. They're too big for the format.
I'm not going to get in the way of Melissa getting off on a rant. I would never do that.
That would be no fun.
You value your life, is what you're saying.
Speaking of things Melissa is ranting about, the Washington State Legislature is back in session as of Monday. It's week 1. We're seeing the storylines develop. But before we get into that, I do want to ask about, the big national news of the week. And it certainly is trickling into our little corner of the country for sure. But the ICE crackdown in Minnesota and the backlash from protesters has been the biggest story in the country this past week. And Melissa, you've been following a bill in Olympia that would put some new requirements on immigration agents. What is going on with that?
Well, there's several pieces of legislation. And the big one that I think had a hearing this week and people have been focused on is banning federal agents and all law enforcement from wearing masks. That's clearly directed at ICE. The sponsor says it's directed at ICE and talking about, 3 people being picked up by masked agents put in unmarked vehicles in North Seattle just this past week or so being, not the motivator because it already was drafted, but that sort of thing being what they're trying to target there. And they think that it will increase trust by preventing this from happening, from making sure faces can be shown in most cases, some exceptions, SWAT teams, et cetera. But they think that's one way to get at this. There's also legislation to say, no, you can't go into non-public areas of daycares and schools and stuff if you're immigration agents without a judicial warrant. So there's lots of stuff on that front that lawmakers are looking at.
And that's a big one.
Paul, there's been a lot of arguments on the right, and we see that there's a court challenge in California over a similar law that they passed there, basically saying that ICE agents have been doxxed and they're receiving threats and things like that. What are you watching for when it comes to how the legislature is approaching the issue of immigration enforcement in the state right now?
Yeah, I think that the interesting question is going to be how this affects sort of local law enforcement. I think we saw the sheriffs and police chiefs come out against that bill yesterday. That's a circumstance where every member of the legislature has some kind of local police force or police forces in his or her district. And so they'll be hearing from those folks. And I think they're going to try and, kind of square that circle in terms of, safety for law enforcement officers versus, the ICE crackdown. I mean, I think that's a real tension.
Is it a thing where they essentially are worried they don't want their police officers clashing with ICE and telling them, don't go into this daycare or don't, put on masks?
I think the issue that they're concerned about sort of is all these exceptions that could arise that aren't contemplated in the bill. Like, it's kind of more technical than that. I don't think it's as sexy as, they don't want to be in the middle of the ICE. I mean, they don't. They don't want to be in the middle of the ICE stuff, but that's not what came up in the hearings. It was more like there might be some circumstance where our local officers might need to wear a face covering that you're not contemplating in this bill, and there's no way to possibly account for all of the circumstances. Like, what if we're in OMAC and it's -6 degrees or 6 degrees, and they need to wear something to not be cold, and you're like, okay. So those kind of things were the things that were coming up at the hearing.
I keep thinking about the rhetoric that we're hearing. Like, Governor Ferguson is saying ICE is out of control. Katie Wilson, the mayor here in Seattle, is denouncing the arrests that happened on Aurora last week of some immigrants that people called 911 over. The rhetoric of local officials is so strong and clear, they are calling these kidnappings. The mayor here called them kidnappings. And I do wonder, like, at what point there is going to be, a potential clash between local officials and what's happening with federal officials.
I've been trying to get at that. Like, I remember the former Seattle mayor had an executive order which was directed at kind of addressing some of this. And I was looking at it saying, I don't really understand what this does, honestly. And I remember asking him, are you saying that you want the police officers to get in between protesters and ICE? And he said, well, that's really hypothetical, blah, blah, blah.
It's not hypothetical anymore.
Like, the whole thing's hypothetical. Sorry, I'm going to rant about people who aren't even in office now. But, the whole thing at that point, it was hypothetical, a likely hypothetical that ICE agents or something might come to Seattle. But, we don't know how this is going to work. A lot of unknowns.
Well, we're going to take a quick break because we have so much to talk about with the legislature, and a lot of it has to do with how the heck we're going to fill this big budget hole. But it's just something that, keeps coming up, obviously, as we watch what's all playing out in Minnesota. And we have similar questions, Melissa. But let's take that quick break, and we'll be right back with Melissa Santos and Paul Queary on Sound Politics.
And we're back with Sound Politics with Melissa Santos and Paul Queary. As we started to get into before the break, we're talking about fights Democrats want and fights they don't want. We'll talk in a sec about an initiative on trans athletes that they seem to not want. But let's start with a fight that Democrats do want. The income tax.
Yeah, this is an income tax on high earners specifically, and it's being called a millionaire's tax. The last time there was an income tax seriously considered, voters rejected it, and that was back in 2010. Nowadays, though, the governor says he supports it. Seems like a lot of Democrats in the legislature are in line. Melissa, first, before we get to the politics of all this, can you just talk about how would this actually work?
Well, it would affect income over $1 million a year. So that's something the Democrats really emphasize. Like, it's not if you have over $1 million, your whole $1,001 is getting taxed. Only the $1 would. So that's something they always point out. They want this would raise $3 billion a year in theory, and in effect, what the governor says is less than half of 1% of taxpayers in Washington state. And the governor has talked about also making sure that $1 million keeps rising with inflation so that it's not that, in 10 years, if we're somehow all making $1 million because inflation's that bad, we still wouldn't pay the tax is what they've said. It's not going to target people who aren't actually wealthy down the road. They're not going to lower the threshold. They're going to keep it up with inflation. That's what they say.
We're all going to be sitting around going, $1 million's not what it used to be. Paul, the legislature adopted a ban on income taxes in 2024. This was part of the Brian Haywood initiatives that year. They got a bunch of signatures. They sent it to the legislature. The legislature said, we don't want that on the ballot. We're going to pass it into law. But Senate Majority Leader Jamie Peterson said on this very pod last month that was a pie crust promise. Easily made, easily broken, which I guess is a line from Mary Poppins. I did not remember it.
I'm not up on the Mary Poppins references.
Yeah, I missed the Mary Poppins.
It's been a long time since I saw Mary Poppins, but apparently there's a whole part where she taxes George Banks. So apparently that's not an obstacle. Democrats can reverse that ban, according to Jamie Peterson, but this would probably go to the ballot. What is your read on the politics of all this? And do you think if they will pass it through the legislature, and if it goes to the ballot, are Washingtonians ready for an income tax, even if it's not on most of them?
Yeah, I think there's two major obstacles to this tax. And the first is that the voters have been at no on this historically. As recently as 2010, that initiative went down in flames.
Which we should say was had a much lower ceiling.
Yeah, exactly.
200,000
right.
For single filers.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's sort of interesting there's interesting polling on that we saw recently that showed that something like 61% of people are in favor of the millionaire's tax. And there was a separate poll last month that was testing out branding on tax, and apparently the millionaire's tax won because we heard that over and over again recently. So that's a really interesting question. Also, the sort of ballot initiative game has changed a little bit because there's a recent law that requires a statement of the sort of fiscal impact for the state on initiatives that repeal something that's in state law. So once this is on the books, if there's a forced repeal, it's going to carry a little warning label on the ballot that says it would cut spending on education and healthcare and so forth. And there's some evidence, especially from the 2024 election, that voters actually respond to that pretty well. I mean, there were some initiatives on the ballot to repeal some tax increases or some things that acted as tax increases in 2024, and they all survived.
Yeah, I think that the math's changed since 2010. I mean, we got it 16 years ago, and I think affordability, as we saw in the last election, is just such a concern for people that they just are not punishing elected officials for trying to tax the rich or talking about taxing the rich. And so Democrats are saying, let's go. And I think we'll see this we likely will see this pass and then it show up on the ballot.
And that same poll that we just saw recently showed that support for the tax craters if you kind of lower the threshold to people who make $100,000 a year. So if it starts to look like a broad income tax, people are definitely a no.
That will be the case that Republicans are going to be making here, though, right? And any challenge to it will make that case.
Absolutely. And I know some people who worked on that 2010 initiative, and that argument was deployed. And they will tell you that that's what killed it.
It's coming for you in the end.
Yep.
It's millionaires today. It's you tomorrow. And I mean, probably the most forceful way I've already heard this argument made is there is no state in the country that has ever passed a millionaire's tax that stayed on millionaires. It's been a long time since any state in the country passed an income tax, but yeah.
And we did see some talk about that when the capital gains tax was being challenged, but people still and in red counties, it still went down to defeat the effort to repeal the capital gains tax.
Yes.
So, Paul, we talked a little bit about the politics. Let's turn to the legal challenge, which is definitely in the works. If we go back to 1933, there's been a series of Supreme Court decisions that said that you cannot have a graduated income tax in Washington state. Paul, this is going to be challenged for sure in the courts. Is it going to pass legal muster?
Yeah, and I mean, that's arguably one of the real reasons for doing this from Democrats' perspective is to actually challenge that court case. That court case is called Culleton, and it found more or less that your money is your property and therefore subject to the limitations on the property tax in the Constitution. Now, a lot of people on the left will argue that decision was wrongly taken, back then. And there's a sort of broad belief/hope that the current court would toss it out if it were squarely before them. And that's kind of the point here. So, I think that, that's the $3.5 billion question, which is about how much that tax would raise on an annual level is whether the court's willing to go there or not.
Melissa, can you just go a little bit more into why does it matter the definition of property and how we tax it here with this question?
Well, there's something in the Constitution that Paul was talking about that says that property must be taxed at a uniform rate. That means you can't, tax rich people or people with really expensive homes at a rate that's higher than people with really inexpensive homes, for instance. Now, because income under this tax ruling, for the Supreme Court ruling, was deemed property, that applies then currently under the case law. But the Constitution doesn't say no income tax. That's not what it says. Yeah. And so that's why Democrats think they don't have to do a constitutional amendment to pass this and then have it potentially stay on the books.
I want to talk about, the governor's, what surprised me, the governor's embrace of this millionaire's tax. I don't know if it surprised you, Paul, but, we both watched Governor Ferguson's State of the State address on Tuesday. His evolution between that State of the State and his inauguration last year was a lot, different. Last year, he was really putting the brakes on the idea of big new taxes to fix the state's code, and this year it's a different story. Here is a little reminder of Governor Bob Ferguson's vibe shift on taxes.
Look, we're not going to tax our way out of this thing. Not going to happen. $15 billion is a lot of money.
The legislature's work is done for now, almost a month after they adjourned. Governor Ferguson signed their operated budget for the next 2 years, including billions of dollars in new taxes.
Our system takes too much in taxes from hardworking families and not enough from the wealthy.
Were you surprised by this kind of quarter turn, or is it a 180? I don't know.
I think the governor's people might, kind of split hairs on this, but I think it's pretty clear what happened. I mean, the governor tried to pivot to the center after he got elected, And, that worked out really poorly for him. He wound up essentially signing the biggest tax increase in state history. And, now I think he's sort of tacked back a little bit to what we saw from sort of candidate Ferguson, who kind of actively courted the left, including the tax the rich left. But yeah, I think his pivot to the center just didn't work out very well for him.
So, Melissa, obviously we've been talking about this shift. I think one of the things that kind of illustrates it the best is last year in his inauguration speech, Governor Ferguson kept bringing up a former Republican governor, Dan Evans, who was known as this kind of bipartisan icon. Republicans were so pumped about his inauguration speech a year ago and about potentially having an ally in the governor's mansion. The vibes are way different now. Way worse on the Republican side of things. After Ferguson's speech on Tuesday, the Republican media availability was pretty fiery, particularly House Minority Leader, Republican Drew Stokesbury, who said, referring to Ferguson a year ago, it looked like he wanted to be a Democrat Dan Evans that Washingtonians remember for generations. And now he looks like a governor desperate to shore up his base before he's primaried. Ouch.
I don't totally disagree with that, although I do think Democrats wouldn't really primary him because they don't have the how would I say this in a nice way? They don't have the guts to do it. However, so I mean, what Bob would say here, because someone asked him. I mean, the first question at one of these things was, what's changed for you, right? What has gone on here? What has been the transition? And he said, well, I always said I just didn't want a budget balanced on a big tax like this. And I'm like, okay, fine. But then so he says this one's different because it wouldn't really, my budget doesn't rely on it. The Democrats aren't talking about making this current 2-year budget rely on it. It wouldn't bring in revenue till 2029, and we understand that. So it gives time for the court challenge, all those things. And so he's kind of making it sound like that was his main objection last year. And he did say that, I guess, at the time. But I do feel like there's been more of a shift than just that. Like he's enthusiastic about this tax, like he's like all in on the rhetoric. I don't know.
That's what I guess I kind of think about when people say, well, Ferguson defenders in Olympia say, he's never actually changed his stance. It's like, but
that's splitting very lawyerly hairs there.
It's always this thing of like, I just can't tell what he believes. I know what he thinks is going to work or will say is going to work at any possible time. But like, I don't know, does he think the rich pay too little? Like up until recently, I could not have told you the answer. And to be honest, I'm not sure if I could tell you definitively now if he actually believes that.
I think that Governor Ferguson governs the state like it's a legal case almost, right? Mm-hmm. So right now he is making the legal case that it like as if we're the judges, the justices, that this is important for fairness in our state. And then that's what I mean. Like, I feel like this is the argument, but I'm not sure. I'm with you. Like, I don't really know what Bob thinks at any time.
Paul, you were laughing earlier. Can we explore that? What do you see happening here with Ferguson's evolution or not?
Well, I mean, I think that we should remember that as Attorney General, he was kind of on board with the progressive revenue train. I mean, he was supportive of the challenge to the capital gains tax was overturned by a lower court, and Ferguson, as Attorney General, just kind of blew it off and sort of ignored it and continued to defend the tax until the Supremes upheld it. So, I tend to think of last year's speech as the outlier, but I'm also somewhat in Scott's camp in that it's not always possible to discover exactly what the governor cares about.
Okay, we are almost done talking about the budget deficit. There is this huge question hanging over all of this, and that is just yet again, and for the last year, and probably for the next, this thing of what is Trump going to try to take away? We were all so shocked, I think, a year ago when Trump started just kind of randomly yanking money. Now it feels almost routine. This week the president cut his administration, I should say, cut $2 billion from addiction and mental health treatment and then just promptly reinstated it. Some local providers like the Washington Recovery Alliance lost grants and then got them back just out of the blue last night. We're taping this on Thursday morning. Trump is now promising on February 1st to cut federal funding again to sanctuary cities and states. And I just don't get the sense anyone here is taking it very seriously anymore. Is this just the new normal?
There's some things that are more certain than others. I mean, the thing that Congress did, the big, beautiful bill or whatever we're calling it this week, I mean, that has real
HR 1, Paul.
Right. That has real budget implications for the state, especially kind of in the out years. I mean, most of it is kind of delayed. And, we had at our kind of annual policy conference last month, we had a panel of healthcare experts. And, they are, they're in a world of hurt. I mean, you look at hospitals, medical providers, so on and so forth. There's just a lot of money that would from the federal government that would ordinarily flow to those folks. It's just not going to be there in upcoming years. And, some of that starts this year. So that's for real. I mean, in terms of sort of, like the messaging about I'm going to cut this or I'm going to withhold that comes out of the White House. I mean, yeah. Nobody exactly knows how much of that's going to hold up, but I mean, there's real stuff coming down the road in terms of federal cuts, definitely.
And I think that's actually going to be one argument the Democrats make for why they need to pass one of these tax measures, like the millionaire's tax, because this will help bolster the state against that uncertainty. We need a really stable revenue that keeps up with our expenses. We have so many people coming looking for state services, especially as federal services decline. That is also real. Like, these caseload increases, that's the people coming seeking state services, long-term care, et cetera. They're just skyrocketing. So that will be part of their argument, that this is us needing to take care of our citizens since the federal government is not doing it.
And it's a rhetorical fight, too, because they're saying, Trump cut taxes on the rich. So, this is just fair. Let's get some of that money that they are saving because of the big, beautiful bill, or whatever we're calling it this week.
Hey, everybody, we're going to have some new initiatives this year, most likely on the ballot.
What a transition.
Democrats in the legislature have signaled they're not even going to hold hearings, definitely not going to pass the two Haywood Let's Go Washington initiatives. One is the ban on trans girls and girls' sports. The other is the revised Parents' Bill of Rights. I've had Brian on Soundside before. We've had him on Sound Politics. You can go back in our feed. We'll share the link to hear more about these latest efforts from him. But can we focus on the trans athletes bill? Because this is such a huge political issue. It obviously drove so much in 2024 in the presidential election. And we see Democrats moving away from defending participation in girls' sports of trans athletes. Gavin Newsom said that it was something that was out of step with the American people and it was deeply unfair. What are you hearing about, especially the trans athlete initiative, from your sources, and like how Democrats are approaching it?
Well, I mean, they've said that they won't hear it at all. And I think that there's a couple of things really working there. One is that it's a good issue for conservatives and Republicans. I mean, we saw it play out in the 2024 presidential campaign. And so, there's a whole sense of we don't really want to give that any oxygen. It's also just generally regarded on the left as anti-trans discrimination and really kind of a cruel and unpleasant, topic to deal with. And so I don't think that there's any real appetite to take that up and to kind of maybe expose some members of the Democratic caucus to what could be a kind of a dicey vote for them.
I guess I expected this to be a moment where a lot of progressives would want to hold hearings in order to show that they were defending, the LGBTQ plus community. But if we are seeing this be, in some cases, a 70-30 issue in polling, a 60-40 issue in polling, are Democrats running away from it, Melissa?
I think that it's a little bit different here in Washington than it is with Newsom in California and others. I mean, Bob Ferguson, for instance, just said when he was asked about this the other day, he said a reporter, Brandy Cruz, who asked about it, he accused her of being obsessed with trans kids and just kind of moved on. Like he said, but his defense wasn't, it was like trans kids are going through a lot right now, and I think that we need to support them in any way we can. That was sort of his statement. Like, we're not going to engage in the finer points of this argument, but we support trans kids is sort of what I'm hearing from Democrats. And so I think it's what Paul said about not giving it oxygen. But I think the support, I don't think, whatever their internal polling is, I don't think the trans issue plays as well in Washington as it might in some other states. For Republicans, I mean.
And also, it's important to remember that the legislature just doesn't have a lot of tools here. I mean, they can they could approve it, which obviously the leaders of the legislature have indicated that they have no interest whatsoever in doing. They could propose some kind of alternative to appear on the ballot next to it, which has happened a very small number of times in state history, or they could just basically ignore it and let it go to the people. And overwhelmingly, that's what the legislature does. Even when they, historically, even when they hold hearings, they're kind of pro forma hearings, and they just, kind of let it go to the ballot and see what happens.
And since the trans participation in sports is already enshrined in Washington law, like having a alternative ballot measure, it might kind of be a moot issue.
Yeah, I think so.
Does that mean that potentially even if it passes, it could get knocked down by a court?
In general, the initiative would supersede the law. That's what it is. It's a change to the law.
Yeah, it's not in the Constitution.
But the other thing I've heard, too, it is interesting because I remember J.B. Peterson, the Senate Majority Leader, was saying the other day that there's I forget the exact number, but less than 10 trans athletes for which this will be an issue in the state. So they were also diminishing it a little bit in that sense. But I do think they're just saying we support trans kids. We're not going to engage in this because they do think it's just discrimination.
I have a final question for you both. We talked about the big storylines in this year's session, but legislative sessions are there's really I honestly, it used to be that Democrats, and maybe they're still doing this, they're like, this year is the year of housing and things like that. But we all know legislative sessions really take place in the small little details, in the weeds, where we love to go. What is one thing you are watching this year that we are not talking about enough? And Melissa, I want to start with you.
Okay, well, I feel like I didn't want to take
or not.
No, I'm happy to. No. I was going to talk about AI, but I wasn't sure that Paul was going to talk about AI. So for me, I do think there's a lot of legislation, and this is why my opening story on opening day of the legislature was about artificial intelligence regulation, because there's like a half dozen bills dealing with this year, and they go far beyond the previous sort of proposals that were just about notification, like letting people know that this chatbot's a robot or something. Yeah. They're saying we need to change how these bots interact with kids. We need to set other guardrails. We also need to maybe make sure they're not being racist. There's all of this legislation dealing with that. So I think that will be a big issue this year. And I have not fully finished reading your coverage today, Paul, of sort of what the tech companies are saying. But the tech companies, I don't think, are super on board with all of that. So that's a tension here.
Yeah, the thing that I'm looking for is this attempt to tax Airbnb, which is that's a bill that failed last year, but it's coming around this year, and Airbnb is very clearly worried about it. They've stood up a pretty fancy campaign, and it kind of indicates that they look like they're going to rumble at the ballot over this. It's called they're calling it the vacation tax.
I was sitting in Olympia, feet away from the governor, as he was preparing to speak on Tuesday, and I get this text: say no to the vacation tax. Did you know politicians in Olympia are proposing new taxes on short-term rentals? This means our vacations could get a lot more expensive. Tell your legislators to oppose any proposed vacation tax by clicking here.
Wow, Democrats against vacations.
Yeah.
They hate fun.
Taxing the joy. Taxing the joy. That's what Stokesbury said.
And we've seen, these kind of national tech platform, consumer-facing tech platforms, kind of rumble with the legislature before. And, Airbnb's got a lot of money. And so that's an interesting fight to watch.
I mean, that bill hasn't even dropped, right? We're getting these texts. Like, that bill doesn't even technically exist right now. Or does it from last year?
Well, yeah, I think it's still in play from last year.
Cut that out, Hans.
No. It's very important, everybody. It's actually so important. You don't necessarily. This is the short session. It is technically a continuation of last year's session. Every bill that was proposed last year that didn't pass is still in play.
Is this important?
It is.
Okay, it is important. Okay. I mean, all right. So, yes, it exists.
Glazed.
Guys, I just switched. I'm like, now I'm the guy who's
you're the wonky guy. You're
now
the wonky
I'm the guy who's in the weeds.
What happened here?
This is
Aren't
2026.
You supposed to be a superficial broadcaster?
Scott Greenstone in 2026 is going in the weeds. He loves the details.
He's just a voice, okay? You guys, thank you so much. Melissa Santos with Axios, Paul Queary with the Washington Observer. So great. It's like a family reunion when you guys come in. It is so fun.
We just yell at each other. We just yell over each other.
Yeah,
That's what
it's
we
actually
do.
kind of a lot like my family.
It's very similar.
We get each other on technicalities.
Thank you so much for being here. And that's it for Sound Politics today. Our editor is Kat Smith. Our producer is Hans Anderson. And I'm Libby Denkmann.
And I'm Scott Greenstone. And this show is only possible because of your support. Please consider a donation by going to KUOW.org/politics. And thank you so much.
Thank you.